Hello, everyone. Today we move to sunny Florida, where today's story took place in early November 2006. It is a story that shows that even seemingly harmless acquaintances who appear completely safe can become dangerous. This is the story of a couple who, after life's setbacks, finally found each other, got married, and were supposed to live a peaceful, happy life. But unfortunately, this podcast wouldn't exist if that had been the case. I invite you to listen to the story of Gene Thurnau and his wife, J.J. Galen Eugene. Gene Thurnau II was born on the 2nd of July 1959 in Kansas City, Jackson County, Missouri, USA. He was described by those who knew him as a charismatic, approachable man in his mid-40s. He had an easygoing demeanor, a friendly smile, and a natural ability to put people at ease. Professionally, he was competent and respected, having served in the Air Force and later working as an air traffic controller. He was known for his focus and reliability. Physically, Gene was of average build, with a presence that made him approachable yet quietly confident. People who knew him often noted his charm and attractiveness, as well as a certain warmth that drew friends and colleagues into his circle. Gene had 3 dachshunds, which he loved dearly. He had a huge heart and was an optimist. When his wife of 20 years became seriously ill, he cared for her for a long time. He was very loyal and devoted. Unfortunately, when his wife recovered, he was dealt a huge blow. She told him she was leaving him for another man. It's not surprising that Gene was devastated. He loved his wife deeply and had invested a great deal of time and energy in her recovery. He certainly hadn't expected such a betrayal. But life went on, and he had to rebuild his life. To try to drown his sorrow, Gene threw himself into work at the Nebraska control tower. Despite the personal hardships he had endured, he excelled at his job. Calm, professional, and well-liked by colleagues, Gene was always reliable. It goes without saying how demanding the work of an air traffic controller is, responsible for the safe and efficient management of aircraft. This job requires stress resistance, focus, and multitasking because the safety of many people depends on the controller's decisions. Unfortunately, the pain of his wife leaving him did not fade, and seeing her occasionally, with everything around him reminding him of her, did not help. For this reason, he decided the best solution was to leave Nebraska. In 2002, he requested a transfer to Florida, where his parents and siblings lived. He wanted to be closer to them. His co-workers supported his decision, but one colleague didn't take it well. Robert Dean Peterson, known as Bob, worked near Gene and was his opposite, very quiet and introverted. Yet he had befriended Gene and was apparently very upset about his move. Gene was perhaps the closest person at work to Bob. Bob often tried to impress him, for example, saying he liked dachshunds just like Gene. Robert was a loner. It wasn't that people disliked him, they simply didn't get the chance to know him, as he rarely talked about himself at work. But he enjoyed spending time with Gene, who had that certain something that drew people in. Gene was always friendly and tactful. It was impossible not to like him. Bob seemed impressed by him. Clearly, he tried to imitate him. For example, he bought an identical car to Gene's, even in the same color. He also bought a dachshund. Both men were the same age, but visually they were different. Gene was a handsome man, while Robert was reportedly overweight and not very attractive. Bob was always polite, but around Gene he became something more, noticeably animated, almost giddy. To anyone observing, it was clear Bob was in awe of him. Every movement Gene made, every decision he took seemed to captivate Bob's attention. It wasn't just admiration. It was a quiet obsession, a fascination that went beyond ordinary friendship. At that time, however, nobody saw Bob as dangerous. Maybe he was eccentric, but harmless. Everyone thought Bob was a good guy, just shy. Gene moved to Florida and no longer thought about his co-worker Bob. He wanted to start a new life. In 2003, Gene flew to the Tampa Bay area of Florida to take up his post at St. Petersburg Clearwater International Airport, where he would work as an air traffic controller. With his warm personality, Gene quickly gained the affection of his new colleagues. He quickly felt at home in Florida and knew that moving to the Sunshine State had been the right decision. Gradually, he rebuilt his life and felt better mentally. At his new job, he also met a woman who caught his attention. Her name was Juanita Formoso, but everyone called her JJ, and also an air traffic controller. She had a child and was a very good and respected employee. She, too, had gone through a difficult divorce after 20 years of marriage. Gene was a gentleman, and their relationship developed at a calm pace, but it was clear that they were attracted to each other from the very beginning. Months passed, and their bond deepened, but at work, they kept their relationship a secret. They kept it secret for 2 years, until Gene decided he wanted to marry JJ because she was the woman he had been looking for. Juanita was overjoyed. Gene was also her ideal partner. Finally, fate smiled upon them, and they could not wait to begin a happy life together. The couple announced their plans at work. Their colleagues sincerely celebrated their happiness and congratulated them. They decided to build a new home together where they would start their new life. They purchased a spacious lot in Land O'Lakes, Florida, in a quiet, secure, and picturesque neighborhood, a perfect place for a new beginning. Construction of their home began, and they decided to get married. It was a modest ceremony, attended only by family and close friends. Gene and his new wife were truly happy. Unfortunately, the couple could never have imagined that their happiness would be short-lived and that the threat would come from the least expected place. Unexpectedly, 3 months after Gene moved to Florida, Bob also relocated there. And guess where he was starting work? That's right, in the same place as Gene. He decided he too wanted to start fresh, and since there were openings at the St. Pete Clearwater Control Tower office, he thought it would be foolish not to take the opportunity. Gene didn't know what to make of it. It seemed a bit strange. Bob started work and, as usual, was a quiet and solid employee. The first strange incident occurred while JJ and Gene were preparing to move into their dream home together. Both owned houses they had decided to sell. To their surprise, Bob offered to buy Gene's house. Gene saw nothing wrong with this until Bob asked something unusual. He wanted to purchase the house along with its sheets and pillowcases. Gene was sure his friend was joking. The sale went through, but of course, Gene did not leave his bed linens behind. Bob could not hide his disappointment. In 2006, the couple's new home was finally ready. They were overjoyed. Meanwhile, Bob kept insisting on visiting them at their new property. He claimed he had a special gift for them to mark their new beginning, but that he couldn't bring it to work. The couple felt awkward, especially since Bob had not been invited to their wedding, and they weren't expecting any gift from him. Bob arrived with a very expensive crystal vase. The couple felt embarrassed by such a lavish gift, and feeling guilty for not inviting him to the wedding, decided to invite him for dinner. Bob, of course, was thrilled. Surely that was exactly what he had hoped for when bringing such a gift. The evening of November 1st, 2006, was meant to be ordinary, a quiet dinner at the Thurnau new home in Pasco County, Florida. But as soon as Bob arrived, the air shifted. He was cheerful, talkative, but there was something in his intensity that made Gene and Juanita exchange uneasy glances. The dinner between Gene Thurnau and Robert Dean Peterson that evening was described as uncomfortable and unsettling. Bob arrived early and insisted on staying for the full meal, consuming multiple servings of each course. He handed the couple a thick, leather-bound album, a proud smile on his face, as Gene and JJ began flipping through it. Inside were glossy photographs documenting the construction of their home, page after page capturing the transformation from an empty lot to a finished house, complete with drapes on the windows and furniture arranged in the den. The images were undeniably professional. Bob had an eye for detail, and his talent as a photographer was clear. Yet despite the artistry, JJ felt a shiver of discomfort. "You've been coming to our house all this time?" she asked, disbelief in her voice. "Every couple of days," Bob said cheerfully, his pride unshaken. "I've photographed everyone's houses from work." Bob's behavior that evening was persistent and unsettling, with no indication that he intended to leave soon. Jean and JJ exchanged furtive glances, feeling trapped in the situation. Suddenly, a car pulled up to the driveway, and someone knocked on the door. It was JJ's adult daughter, with whom she had an appointment that evening. JJ explained that she was about to leave with her daughter, hoping Bob would take the hint and leave. However, he had no such intention. Surprised, she looked at her husband, hoping that once she returned, their guest would finally go. She did not suspect that this would be the last time she would see Jean alive. After JJ left with her daughter, Bob claimed he had one more gift for Jean but needed to retrieve it from his car. He returned with a letter. One can only imagine the shock Jean must have felt reading it. In the letter, Bob confessed his love. "I have loved you for some time now," Bob had written, "but I've always chickened out when I tried to tell you." The letter began. It wasn't the kind of affection one friend feels for another. It was deeper and unsettling. His note said he wasn't sure if he was gay, but he knew he loved Jean. The letter turned threatening, with Bob stating that he would not leave the house until they had an intimate encounter. "I feel like I've been living a lie all these years, and I just can't do it anymore," Peterson wrote in the note. "I've already asked for God's forgiveness." When JJ returned home, Bob's car was gone, which relieved her. Unfortunately, what she found inside would stay with her for the rest of her life. She found a blood trail in the driveway and her husband's clothes in a bloody pile on the floor, along with a note on the end table addressed to Jean, the contents of which we already know. Neither Jean nor Bob were anywhere to be found. She tried calling her husband, but his phone was at home. The amount of blood left no doubt that something terrible had happened. As JJ walked through the living room, something on the floor caught her eye. When she bent down, she realized it was a bullet casing. In that moment, the truth hit her like a wave. A gun had been fired inside her home. JJ grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, Pasco County Sheriff's deputies were on their way. Overwhelmed and terrified, she could only imagine the worst, that Jean had been shot and that Bob had taken him. Search efforts for both men, the kidnapped and the dangerous suspect, began immediately. For JJ, it was a long, agonizing wait, but she held on to hope that her husband was alive and would return home. Unfortunately, the worst happened. Units raced toward Bob Peterson's residence in Ellenton, but the house stood dark and empty. Jean was nowhere to be found. Officers conducted a thorough search, hoping for any clue that might reveal his whereabouts. It would take 2 days before investigators discovered a rental agreement for a house in Safety Harbor, Florida. It became clear that Bob had planned this in advance. Deputies were immediately dispatched to the property, and what they found was chilling. Inside the master bedroom, Bob Peterson lay on the bed, wearing only a t-shirt and underwear, having taken his own life. Beside him on the floor was Jean Thurnau, also shot. Tragically, the violence did not end there. Jean's body had been mutilated, an act that underscored the disturbing intensity of Bob's obsession. Jean Thurnau's death was devastating for Juanita, and she struggled to comprehend how one act of cruelty had shattered their lives forever. She spoke to police about Robert Peterson's unusual behavior around her husband, but insisted she had no idea of the depth of his obsession. Later, when investigators learned that Peterson had attempted to proposition Jean, Juanita was certain that her husband had firmly rejected him. Despite everything, Juanita tries to see the good in people and has said, "I don't hate Bob. How can you hate someone who is mentally disturbed?" In an appearance on Investigation Discovery, she reflected on the positive moments in her life, saying she felt fortunate to have known Jean and to have experienced what it was like to be truly loved. Coping with such a tragedy has been incredibly difficult, but she credits her faith in God with helping her stay strong. Juanita now prefers to keep her current life private, but it appears she has found happiness and moved forward. Rest in peace, Jean. Your life, though tragically brief, touched the hearts of those who knew you. You brought love, warmth and laughter to your family and friends, and your memory will live on in their hearts forever. Though the circumstances of your passing were heartbreaking, the impact you made in your life, the joy you shared, and the love you gave will never be forgotten. Thank you for listening to this tragic story. Take care of yourselves.